Welcome to the 66th episode of our Crossing Thin Ice podcast series, where twice a month we tackle risk management topics. Our aim for these podcasts is to help with your ERM program and general risk knowledge. We encourage you to share with anyone interested in lifelong learning about risk management, and we welcome your feedback. You can also find Crossing Thin Ice in your Substack feed. My name is Max Rudolph, and as always, I'm joined by Dave Ingram. Today, Dave is going to share his thoughts on business success. This is the first discussion of three, with this one focused on how good judgment can be integrated into your risk management process to make better choices. As a reminder, nothing in today's podcast is intended to be investment advice. We are here to provide educational material on risk topics without getting lost in the weeds.
A couple of weeks ago, I recorded a podcast about risk and reward, where I suggested that good judgment, good timing, and good execution were more important to business profits than risk. Now I'm going to take a step in a more actionable direction. I'm going to explain each of these three requirements for business success and give my thoughts on how risk management can help with each. Today, we're starting with judgment. Good judgment is the short name for making the right choices, picking the most likely winners. But that's not really a helpful definition. To make that actionable, we can break good judgment into four main steps, which if you follow that path, you're much more likely to end up with that right choice. My vote for these four steps would be: number 1, look around; number 2, look forward; number 3, look backwards; and number 4, make plans. Look around means assessing the current situation, the market, your situation, your customers, and your capabilities. Risk management can help with this assessment. Are there opportunities now that you can exploit? Are you exposed to risks that you want to reduce? Has your level of risk been growing faster than your capacity to bear risks? Where do you want to be avoiding concentrating more risk? How does the choice that is being considered stack up against the answers to these questions? Look forward means doing scenario analysis. Imagine likely and somewhat unlikely futures, and then assess how the new choice would be different in different futures. This is where you identify emerging trends, market shifts, and future challenges or opportunities that aren't immediately apparent. Risk management can be the source for some or all of those future scenarios. Imagining such futures is a regular activity, and good scenarios for this analysis might already be there on the shelf. Look backwards means looking to find any past experiences of yours or someone else's that can provide any guidance in this choice. It involves analyzing what has worked, what didn't, and why, and provides valuable context and prevents the repetition of mistakes. This is another regular function of risk management. There may already be case studies on the shelf that provide valuable real-world insights, or some research may be needed. Make plans means looking for the best course of action for a variety of futures that will evolve from the choice under consideration in as many of these alternative futures that were identified. These would be chosen reflecting the wisdom gained from that look backwards and that might apply to each future that is considered. Plans that you make will focus on things like capturing opportunities by developing strategies to seize identified opportunities effectively. Risk mitigation and contingency management by crafting plans to prevent, reduce, or respond to anticipated threats. This includes creating backup plans. And ethical implementation, ensuring that the chosen plans and their execution methods are consistently aligned with the company's ethical principles, making responsible choices even when facing trade-offs. Now, in many situations, you have more than one option, so you'll need to repeat these steps for each option. Then you'll have to decide. And after doing these 4 steps, you'll need to make your choice. You do that by applying your decision-making criteria on what you learned from these 4 steps. Usually, the decision-making criteria are a mixed bag of various considerations that sometimes contradict each other. Some common criteria include profits and risks, of course, fit with company strategy and organizational capabilities, impact on stakeholders, society, and the world, and reputation, ethical, and legal implications. You should ask, how does this decision have any impact on who we are as a company? That question can be applied to all of the list of decision criteria. Let me apply it to risk as an example. I think of risk appetite as the ultimate expression of who we are related to risk. So the question would then be, does this decision require us to change our risk appetite? Must we become comfortable with more risk, or with new risks, or with less well-known risks, or with risks that are more difficult to mitigate? Since there really are always multiple criteria, there's often not a clear best choice, and that is where the practice of satisficing comes in. This is a decision-making process that was identified by Herbert Simon as he was working on developing artificial intelligence in the 1950s. With satisficing, you will expect to choose a satisfactory alternative, since it is unlikely you'll be able to assess all possible alternatives to find the absolute best. That means you'll need to look at each criteria and identify minimum acceptable compliance with that criteria. Finally, once you've used good judgment to make a decision, you should plan to take decisive action, committing to a course of action after thoughtful consideration, knowing when to move forward and when to reconsider, and always being prepared to adapt. By looking around, looking forward, and looking backwards, you have made all of the preparation to make plans for a variety of futures, and now to live out those plans. Risk management does have a major role to play in the company's good judgment process, with assessment of the current situation, development of scenarios, and recollection of past experiences. In addition, risk management should be able to point to their own processes to illustrate how good judgment has always been the rule.
Dave, you wrote an interesting article on using good judgment regarding business decisions. Can you talk about some examples where that's worked and maybe some where it hasn't worked?
Sure, Max. Let me give you a couple examples, and I like to draw these examples from my recollection of things that happened around the financial crisis in 2008. A lot of life insurers that I was paying attention to at that time were involved in variable annuities, and in particular, the most successful companies were doing a lot of work on variable annuities with embedded guarantees. As you may or may not recall, a lot of those guarantees acted as pretty extreme derivatives. They had a quite leveraged impact on the product, depending on the performance of the stock market, and very particularly depending upon negative performance of the stock market, because they were guaranteeing the performance of the variable annuity contract under various conditions and at various levels of performance. On the topic of judgment, there was quite a range of judgment that was applied there. Many companies just followed the pack, and the pack kept adding more and more to the guarantees year after year. But there were a couple of companies, some larger companies that because of their size did a lot of this business, even if they didn't have the most competitive products, who designed their products in such a way that they shared some of the risk of those guarantees with the policyholders in some cases, and in other cases they restricted the policyholders' ability to take extreme positions. By product design, those companies applied some really good judgment that was paying attention to the possibility that things might go really bad in the stock market, as they have on occasion, very rare occasions, but they have, and they did. And so those couple of companies that did use that good judgment in their product design wound up losing much less money. Everybody lost some money in that situation, but their loss of money was much smaller than the companies that were way out front. And the second example I'll give is another company that was one of those at the front of the pack. They were a top 10, probably a top 5 seller of variable annuity contracts. In the very last year of before the financial crisis, that company looked at two things. They looked at the stock market and saw where it was, and they looked at the competition and saw what the kind of the next step was in adding to those benefits. And they just said, no thanks. They failed to, for the first time in their run as a variable annuity writer, they failed to keep up with the top writers, and they dropped out of their position in the top five. I think they still hung into the top 20 or something, but it was quite a huge drop in sales for them. And it turned out that their judgment was good there. While they didn't avoid any losses or like the first couple of companies that I mentioned, their losses were reduced by at least 30% because of not having the business that they had just written at the peak of the stock market with those guarantees. So that company's judgment was not a structural judgment like the first set of companies, but it was a situational judgment where they assessed the situation and said there's too much risk in this.
Yeah, it's very hard to take the punch bowl away from yourself. The regulator tries to take that approach at times, but you've got salespeople saying you're cutting, taking money away from them and things like that. So it's a very strong statement when they do actually do that, and it's nice to see that sometimes they're right.
I guess on the other side of that, the bad judgment, I alluded to this already, that most of the market leaders just kept ratcheting this up and up and up. Many of those companies had hedging programs, and it turned out that their judgment about the ability to hedge in a crazy market was just not there. A lot of these hedging programs were not buying long-term hedges. They were buying hedges positions that they were adjusting almost daily. Some of them were only adjusting weekly. But as the market got really frothy right before the crash there, the mismatch that showed up in their hedge book turned out to be 7 or 8 weeks worth of movement from what they'd prepared for, so that they were hedging, assuming a movement much smaller than what happened in the market from day to day. And so they were left holding the bag for a significant fraction of that market movement because their hedges were only covering a small part of that. So that was a bad judgment. They were assuming that something that they had seen in the way the market for the derivatives they were using for hedging during good times would hold during bad times, and they just had no experience in that. And so their judgment was poor, assuming that the market was just as liquid on the worst day as it was on the best.
Yeah, that's an important reminder that the distribution for derivatives during normal trading is much more predictable and much easier to work with than when you get into the tail and all of a sudden liquidity becomes an issue. And if we got into a depression or a huge amount of volatility that lasted several years long, contracts don't last that long. So even if you're hedged initially, 2, 3 years down the road, you're not hedged and nobody's going to write that contract for you.
And my extreme example of bad judgment on this, this is the story that in retrospect sounds the craziest to me, is that there was one large company that had a very large amount of variable annuity exposure. And they kept saying, well, we're going to do a hedging program. We're going to do a hedging program. But we're a large company. This is only one of our products. This isn't that big of a deal. The market tanked and they hadn't bought any hedges yet. And when you asked them about it afterwards, the judgment that they had was, well, those hedges got to be too expensive. They failed to buy the hedges because buying the hedges when they're expensive it is a guarantee of a cost that's going to run through your bottom line. But it's like saying, well, I didn't buy homeowners insurance while the hurricane was coming up the coast because it was too expensive. It turned out to be much more expensive for that company to not buy the hedges because the company almost failed because of the very large losses that they incurred from that situation.
Yeah, you always want to look at your potential tail events, when you're in that normal trading environment and put your hedges on then, because if you wait, like you say, it becomes expensive if you can even find the coverage at all.
The companies that had the bad judgment, I think, to some extent fall into the category of something we talked about on a recent podcast, which is risks that are in the dark. The people with bad judgment didn't see risks that weren't right out in front of them because they just didn't have the imagination to see what might happen in that extreme situation that came up in the financial crisis.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Crossing Thin Ice about using good judgment with risk management by looking around, looking forward, looking backwards, and making plans. A practitioner can use the practice of satisficing to make good decisions that meet your minimum standards for each criterion. If you found it valuable, please like, subscribe, and share with your colleagues.